Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we are at long last taking a look at the Hologram Effects Microcosm. I have wanted to and been putting off doing a deep dive on the microcosm since I got it in May of last year. Hologram was kind enough to send one out to me in May of 2020 just to kind of see what I thought and everything, and I attached myself to it so severely and completely that if you follow me on Instagram, you know that you will almost never see me writing without it anymore. Last year I did a Guitar.com ambient guitar tone masterclass for their virtual trade show, and in earnest, you could have almost called that video a review of the microcosm because it was so central to how I arrange ambient guitar parts. But that deep reliance on this pedal, pitted against how many features it has, is actually the reason that I have been procrastinating and pushing back doing this video. Hologram reached out late last year to ask if I would do one of these deep dives on it, and and my goal was to have it done by February 2021. And for those of you keeping track at home right now, it is Thursday, September 9th, 2021. We are finally doing this video. And in earnest, it feels like it's kind of the first era of playing with this thing that I really feel like I have a really meaningfully strong understanding of how to talk about it and how to present it in a way that isn't just me gushing about it or using 3 modes in an effective way. I think that I've hit a point where I can use even the weird stuff on this pedal effectively, even the stuff that when I first got it, I would skip past that bank every time. I think I have written with every single mode on this pedal now. We are not going to go through every single one in this video because we would be here for several hours in earnestness, especially with the way that I get sidetracked with modes that I love in pedals, which you will know if you've seen any of my more feature-length videos on this channel. We are going to dig into something from every single bank of sounds on this thing. And we're not just talking the big banks. We will grab at least 1 or 2 things from Mosaic, Sequence, Glide, every single mode on this thing. So hopefully you've got some time ahead of you. But before we jump into that, I want to talk through some of the non-sound design features in this pedal, why I think they're essential, and why I think it makes this thing so valuable for live and studio use. Because I don't want this to be really a review, we're going to go really quickly into our top-down view of the pedal board and just start like running through some sound samples. There's a couple things I want to talk about before we jump into that, which is one, we are running mono in, stereo out. This pedal can be configured for stereo in as well. I happen to like it pretty early in my chain, kind of as early as I can get it, so that it kind of sits before my stereo wet effects and everything. So for me, the important thing is that I always run it in stereo out because the stereo image on this pedal is excellent. You will hear that in some of the modes more than others, and you will definitely hear that when we start digging into the reverb and the modulation on the dry tone. To that end, we are going to split up the next part of this video into 3 sections. Section 1 will be the kind of dry mode only setup, where if you set it into looper only mode, you apply your filter, your modulation, and your reverb to your dry guitar signal. So we'll mess with that first. Section 2 will be us diving into all of the various modes on this pedal and playing with some of the standout features and how those engines interact with the filter and reverb and everything else on this pedal. And then section 3 will be playing with the looper in conjunction with everything else going on in this pedal to do big, grand sound design, kind of all within this one pedal. We will be using the rest of my pedal board in conjunction with this because, as always, I think it's important to look at a piece of gear in the context of what you will be using it with. So we will dial back some of the other wet effects that we would normally be using, but we still will be using a bunch of other stuff on my pedal board because that's how I write music, and that's how hopefully you do too. So we'll be clear about what is doing what, but you will be hearing the Volante by Strymon, the Mercury 7 by Meris, as well as the Gen Loss by COOPERFX and Chase Plus Audio, as well as the tools putting together our bass dry guitar tone, my compressor, my preamp, that kind of stuff. And lastly, one of my favorite things about this pedal is how effectively everything locks into MIDI. So we are going to be recording the next section of this video 2-click. I'll be able to hear it because I'll have my headphones on. You guys won't be able to hear it, but just know we are MIDI clocking everything because this is one of my favorite things about this pedal. The ability to MIDI sync your microcosm to the rest of your pedal board or to your Ableton rig or whatever, especially like you heard on that intro track, is essential for kind of organizing the ideas and creating a lot of really, really amazing cohesion to what you're writing. So let's wrap up this part of the video. Let's go to our top down and let's dig into some of the sounds that the microcosm has to offer. We are now at the pedal board portion of the video. Like I said, we are going to start off by playing with the filter, reverb, and modulation effects on the microcosm. Before we start looking at the parameters of the microcosm, let's run through the context with which we're working. I am playing a 1972 Fender Mustang into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Boss VO1 vocoder, the 1981 Inventions DRV, the Origin FX Cali 76, the Benson Preamp, the Old Blood Noise Endeavors Dweller, the Chase Bliss Audio and COOPERFX Generation Loss into the Hologram Effects Microcosm. From there, we split in stereo to the Strymon Volante, the Mercury 7, two 29 Pedals OAMPs, the Walrus Audio ACS1 running R amplifiers, basically set as two Fender amps, into the Pinstripe Pedals DISO Plus, taking us into Universal Audio's Luna DAW, where we are using a Neve 1073 preamp on the Unison. For the bulk of this, we are not going to do any real changing to our dry tone structure. We will introduce and remove the Mercury 7 and the Volante at different points over the course of this. But our bass dry tone is going to be the 29 Pedals EUNA, the two WAMPs, the compressor, and the Benson Preamp. So let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, so to get into the dry mode affecting of the microcosm, you go into your phrase looper, and then you select looper only. It bypasses the effect blocks in the top right-hand corner of the pedal, and instead applies your modulation, your reverb, and your filter to your dry guitar signal to the extent that you have your mix turned up, which is an important piece of it that we will look at in just a second. So let's start by turning on the pedal. So you can hear that boost that just came in. I have my effect volume cranked as a sub parameter on the pedal because some of the effects can come through a little bit quiet. So I have it all just kind of turned up extra loud across the board. And let's start by introducing that stereo reverb. So I love that. There's a few different stereo reverbs in this pedal. I happen to really like this giant ambient one. We'll take it down to kind of like the minimum decay time. And let's listen to kind of it at its max, its craziest, and let's pay attention to how you can then use the mix control to really create some interesting moments. So we are at like the most, and then let's crank the mix as well. So we're now at like full wet, full decay time, absolute chaos. Dial it back a little bit, but you'll notice it's still very present. And this is where we start introducing the mix as well as the filter in some interesting ways. So let's bring back in some of our original dry tone. And then let's dial that filter back. Because the filter is only affecting the wet send, it will darken up that reverb without darkening up our dry signal in conjunction. So conversely, if we turn that reverb back down so you can actually hear our dry signal at full wet, and then dial that filter back, you will hear it apply to our dry guitar as well because the mix is maxed out. Which, like I said, can create some really beautifully murky reverbs. Okay, let's take a step back from the reverb. Let's look at the modulation in this thing. And then, oh, actually, before we do that, let's actually crank up the resonance on that filter a little bit to give you a sense of kind of that synthy aesthetic of the low pass filter. So we'll turn the reverb down a little bit. And now for some ambience. And then let's turn that resonance, or that filter down with the resonance crank so you can hear a slightly more, like I said, very like electronic synthy sounding filter. You can hear that notch. Which you could use something like the Old Blood Expression Ramper to kind of automate that filter opening and closing under your dry signal like this, which would be very cool. I really love that filter when it's really like kind of accentuated like that. It can be very fun on a lot of the synthier sounding engines in this pedal. Okay, taking the reverb back out, let's dial up our mod depth and rate for the vibrato in this pedal. So there's some really good vibrato sounds. Pretty straightforward, but because it's only on that wet signal and you have a mix control, this pedal is actually one of the coolest sounding choruses I've come across in a while. So let's exaggerate that vibrato a little bit more, and then let's tone it back down. So now we're into that's a little bit more than I would normally go for. We'll soften that depth up a little bit. And we can use that filter to kind of even further tame what we're hearing. Turn that resonance back up. throw some wet effects after it, and you just made your most unnecessarily impressive chorus. Oh yeah, and you can add reverb to just the chorused portion of that signal. As you can tell, there's no reverb on my dry guitar. So now you just have like a murky, persistent reverb or a murky, persistent chorus. Which holds as a really effective bass. So yeah, this is looper only mode and applying the microcosm effects to your dry signal. Let's look at the engines. The microcosm is separated out into 4 sections. Each one has a few engines that each have 4 kind of implementations of that engine within them. And they're kind of grouped by effect type, essentially. So we're going to start up where everybody else starts, which is with the Mosaic, because it's the first thing. And I think it is the most easily accessible and the one that is the most easy to tell kind of like what the like impressive practical application is. The Mosaic modes are essentially a series of micro loopers catching your input playing and kind of spitting it back out to you in interesting and musical ways, different pitches, different directions, that kind of thing. We're starting with the activity all the way at the bottom so that you can kind of hear what happens as more layers get introduced. We've got our time knob right in line with our tempo that's happening in my DAW. So it's at 120 beats per minute. And I think that's everything you need to know. You will notice that I prioritize the mix at full wet or the mix just below noon for different types of engines more than others. And that is because some of these engines are really good at giving you some immediacy in the way they react to your playing, and some do not. Some kind of take a minute to, not a minute, but some take a second to grab onto what you're playing and start delivering it back to you. The Mosaic ones are some of the ones that kind of like aren't so immediate that you can kind of play rhythmically at full wet with them. So we're going to dial that mix back a little bit. We'll dial the repeats up and we'll take the space control all the way down so you can just hear specifically what's happening at the top here before we start introducing some reverb elements to it to kind of like muddy things up. So you can hear more and more loops kind of in that stereo field introducing themselves. And these are the kinds of moments in these videos where I think it's really valuable to start introducing some other pieces of your guitar pedal board's context, essentially. What we're going to do is bring in the Mercury 7 to kind of create some glue between all the various micro loops in the original signal coming through. You can kind of hear how they build up over time, looking for kind of like starting and ending points of your guitar signal to kind of build the loops around. You can hit that rotary knob to reverse the direction, which is really effective for this mode, I find. And you can bring that mix up and dial that filter a little bit farther back for some really cool, very lo-fi synthy vibes kind of surrounding your signal. So you'll notice that in this kind of like A mode under Mosaic, you're hearing the loops come back at the same speed or double speed. So let's jump over to mode D in the Mosaic, which is half speed, full speed, double speed, and quadruple speed, which I think is very, very fun, especially with that activity cranked, your repeats cranked, and just kind of like a willingness to let it really run away with it. Okay, let's jump into sequence mode, which is a bunch of kind of like short looped samples that kind of get twisted and rearranged and create kind of new rhythmic patterns based on what the microcosm has grabbed from your playing dynamics. This is one of those modes that I find to be really, really valuable with click when you're running MIDI clock like I am, because you can create things that sit rhythmically within your project really effectively, and I love that. So we are going to start with mode 1. You can see that I've cranked the mix back up to maximum, and it's because this is one of those modes that I think really benefits from that. We'll dial the mix back a little bit in a second so you can hear the difference, but I like the way that this mode grabs onto your signal at full wet to give you a somewhat immediate feeling playback idea. Okay, so you're hearing the way that it kind of like has that really cool rhythmic component. Let's use this opportunity to look at the time control. We'll take it to 2x and see what it does to that same pattern. As I turn up that activity knob, you start to hear that little sample we've got grabbed onto get kind of reformed with some kind of randomness to it. It's a really, really cool, consistent rhythmic thing you can introduce to your playing through this pedal, which is really interesting. Let's jump over to mode C in sequence, which introduces a bunch of independent filters on individual chunks of the samples being introduced. So we've dialed our mix back so we can hear a dry tone, and we'll kind of hear how those kind of filtered segments that are randomized under our playing kind of accentuate the structure of the dry tone. That kind of skittery glitchiness that consistently follows your rhythmic playing. Super cool. Let's jump on to the next section. Okay, we are into what I would consider to be the mode that took me the longest to figure out. We're going to dial up. This is glide, by the way. We're going to do glide C. It's an octave below up to unity. where, as you can tell by the name, it grabs your note, samples it, and then just sweeps your pitch from an octave down up to where you need to be. We will go ahead and make it really exaggerated so you can hear why I had such a hard time figuring out the use case when I first got started with this pedal. And then we will dial in what I consider to be one of my absolute favorite modes on this thing for kind of writing panned out in the mix textural parts that sound really amazing with some delay and reverb supporting it. So let's go to a full wet, kind of overdone version of this. So this is a full wet version of the glide mode. So maybe not the most tasteful thing for your mix, but let's actually use the hold mode to kind of like lock it in place. Even using that filter, it tames it in a way where suddenly it's a really cool rhythmic piece. Go to half speed, so it's coming at half the rate that it normally would. And let's bring in our dry signal. This is another one of those modes that, like I said, it benefits from the pedal board context. So let's bring in our Volante with some repeats afterwards, some tape repeats, so you can kind of hear how it spreads out those repeating pitch shifts in a very, very interesting way in the stereo space. Okay, so we are now in, I think, one of my favorite and most interesting sets of modes in this pedal, the glitch area, which I specifically love because I think blocks is maybe my most relied upon set of sounds in this thing. You'll notice we're back at full wet at this point, and that is because I think that full wet is like the place to live, especially for blocks A, which is kind of like one of my go-to synthy rhythmic guitar playing devices in this pedal. It's also a really great spot to kind of like focus in on some other stuff, being the shape knob with the different waveform shapes, as well as utilizing the time knob effectively, the activity knob in interesting ways, and and one of my favorite things would be introducing other pedals in your context to kind of shape the tone of what we're about to play with. So let's go ahead and start with a really basic set of blocks A, no activity knob up, just kind of like one of my go-to rhythmic components of this thing. So this is like one of my favorite things, like I said, right off the bat. You'll notice that I use stuff like this a lot in my playing, and you'll notice that you heard a bunch of it on the intro piece for this video. All that stuff is playing back perfectly locked in with my MIDI clock that's running right now. Let's use this as an opportunity to talk about, like I said, a few things. One, and one of my favorite ones, is playing dynamics. Getting this pedal to do what you want it to do, which can sometimes seem like a challenge. One of the things that I picked up on in this mode is the fact that you can let go of the chord at specific times to get the pedal to do what you want it to do. Let's take those repeats to like near maximum. Like I said, I have a click going in my head right now and the pedal is locked to that click. So if I play a chord and let go of it within the interval and it's not hearing new input signal from me, it will actually just hold on to that chord at its same strength forever. So let's hear that. So you can kind of hear that as it just kind of like plays on itself. It stays nice and strong like that. Whereas if I play that chord and I let it decay naturally, to the extent that my guitar will sustain, you will hear it start to grab samples of softer versions of the chord. Right there, you can hear that softer, duller rhythm, and it's because the chord has kind of dropped in volume and dropped an attack on the guitar, and the microcosm is now grabbing onto that new piece. So you hear those softer versions of that. Whereas if I turn that filter back and I let go of it on time, it'll actually kind of create a really cool percussive rhythm. And you'll notice I held that last chord. Really cool. One of my favorite things on this pedal. And while we're talking about those shapes and those percussive elements, let's run through our 4 waveforms in this pedal. You basically have 2 symmetrical and 2 asymmetrical wave shapes. You have a square wave, a triangle wave, and then a half and half that ramps up and drops off, and one that drops up, or that square waves up and then ramps back down on the back half of it. This first one is our square wave. So very straightforward. The second one is my favorite because it's the ramps up, square wave off on the back, which gives it a very side chainy feel to things. Let's jump over to triangle. It's going to be kind of the softest one. A little bit bouncier. And then you have square wave up and triangle down. And that can feel really, really excessive, but there are ways, like I said, to soften it up. So like, we've got that locked in place. Now there's a dotted eighth rhythm sitting behind it, which introduces some cool stuff. A very cool percussive piece. And within this same context, let's talk about adding other pedals to kind of accentuate what it is that you're working with here. And let's go to one of my favorite pairings with the microcosm, the Chase Plus Audio and COOPERFX Generation Loss. So here's our usual. And the generation loss. Let's jump over to one of the more kind of rhythmically complex versions of blocks, turn our mix down, and kind of see how that generation loss plays in with some of those crazier moments. We'll actually bring the generation loss out. Let's try to grab a cool sample of that. I just find it to be such an interesting thing to be able to kind of like, this pedal responds so well to something kind of lo-fi and grainy, which I think is really, really fun. Let's jump over to Interrupt, which has some really cool stuff, especially at full wet. And I like the mix maxed out on some of the Interrupt stuff because you still get your dry signal, but then you get it punctuated by interesting pieces. You can dial that mix back to always have your dry signal and then to just have little bursts of it underneath it. But I'm a big fan of the kind of like unpredictability. Ooh, that was cool. So, interrupt A, as you can tell, with your mix at max, especially if you put it in reverse, suddenly your guitar will just turn over on itself. The activity is obviously introducing way more interruptions. We take it all the way down. It's giving us a little bit more breathing. I really like that reverse mode. And this is actually a cool opportunity to bring that lo-fi vibe back in. And so in that same round, you can go over to B, which introduces some pitch shifted elements. Let's take it to quarter speed and kind of see what that does for the types of samples it picks up. Really like that. So we'll bring in some of our original dry tone and you can kind of hear the difference. I, for one, am a big fan of the full wet version of that. I like kind of feeling like I intermittently lose control of what my guitar is doing. So mode C, this is one of the few that will actually go through all of them because this one introduces a bunch of filtered elements that I find very, very interesting. And back up to full wet, because why wouldn't we? Take that filter wide open. And then lastly, D starts to introduce some bit crushing and some really, really wild elements of kind of like sample manipulation. So we'll take the activity down to 0, and then we'll kind of introduce that as we play. Now we're talking. Introduce some of the like built-in reverb again. Let's actually take this moment to use our effect volume control. And our filter. I would be lying if this wasn't awesome. I don't know where I would use this, but I love it. Get back to that sweet spot. And we're back to full. And that is why I love the interrupt modes. And finally, in glitch mode, we are going to jump down into the ARP modes, which once again, I'm a really big fan of. I think that the way it grabs onto the individual notes out of your chord is very glitchy and weird and hard to predict, but in a way that I find very, very enjoyable. So we'll start with the mix at full, and then we will dial in something a little bit more balanced. Oh, by the way, the activity knob here controls the number of steps in that arpeggiated sequence. And as you are noticing a pattern, I am sure, if we drop to arpeggio mode B, it starts introducing some really cool pitch sequencing. Let's try going full wet on this. I'll bring a tiny bit of my kind of like low volume dry tone in so that you can kind of hear what I'm giving it while still being able to focus on how it parses out what I've been playing. And again, talking pedalboard context, this is one of those moments where I like to bring in a little bit of that fuzziness and something kind of rhythmic afterwards, like a nice stereo delay to kind of soften up the edges of some of these steps, which are really cool, but very, very kind of like set in stone. I haven't played anything in a while. It's just doing its own thing now. It's very cool. Okay, let's jump up into the granules portion of this pedal. We're going to start with haze, and I actually find this section to be really, really great, specifically for kind of murky pad-like textures. Haze, tunnel, and strum are all going to tend to give you a more diffused, a more granularly focused, like very small grains of your signal playing back. That I think is really cool. There's a lot of great stereo imaging in this section of the pedal, and a lot of really, really great, like I said, just kind of pad building stuff. So with this section, we're going to play with the time knob, the space knob a little bit more, and we're definitely going to mess with the shapes. We might go with a triangle for most of this section. We'll actually bring back in some of the modulation to kind of prevent it from feeling too kind of static or sterile. So let's start with just kind of a really basic haze 1. It's not the way that I would normally set a lot of my other stuff. So we're using that kind of asymmetrical waveform that I like. We got the activity at noon, the repeats nice and high, the filter wide open, and we're full wet at a kind of like right on tempo. So you hear a lot of those like very small grains. You can kind of control the like kind of the density of the grains as well as kind of the spread of them with that activity knob. And let's actually go to halftime to see if we can get some kind of bigger chunks out of that. And then, like I said, this is a good opportunity to bring in some of that modulation, some of that vibrato that this thing has. We're going to jump over to that triangle wave and see how that hits. Bring down that modulation depth a little bit. And then, like I said, let's bring in some of the built-in reverb on just that wet signal, and then we'll dial our mix back a little bit. And so now you can kind of hear how that bed will really do a lot to support your playing dynamics. Let's take the Mercury 7 out of this so you can hear how much kind of like faux, heavily diffused reverb we get out of this. So mix at 0, no reverb. And a great application for that hold function as well. Let's grab a new sample. without introducing any additional reverb after the fact. Let's bring up a little bit of reverb on that held sample. Kick on the dweller out in front. Again, there's no extra reverb being added anywhere to my signal. I'm just adding a delay up front that isn't interacting with the microcosm. It's just to give my dry signal a little bit of vibe. So we just jumped over to Haze B, which kind of more heavily randomizes the granules and the samples that it's playing back, which softens the sound even more. So let's actually take that space reverb all the way back down to 0 and jump between A and B so you can hear the difference. There's more murkiness there. There's less predictability. There's a little bit more of a kind of random ambient pad sound going. Like I said, it's a great thing to play on top of. Okay, let's let go of that and actually try playing with that one a little bit. It's fascinating to hear the string noise get picked up a little bit in there. And then let's jump down to C, which starts introducing octave up, and then D, which will introduce octave down. This might be one of the only good shimmer reverbs on the planet, mostly because it's not a real shimmer reverb. Let's go into the tunnel modes. And like I said, this is the section of the pedal that I think focuses the most on granular stuff, droning effects, that kind of thing, like those big ambient pads. This one focuses a lot more on like drones. Like it obviously it's called tunnel, so it really feels like it just kind of like focuses in very directly on sustaining a piece of your playing as opposed to that very scattered thing we were hearing before. So as you can tell, this first one, it feels very kind of strange and kind of like out of sorts. And what's happening here is it's compressing and lengthening the sample that it's grabbing of your guitar. You can kind of hear it stretch really far apart and get granular and then crunch together and have that kind of stuttering thing. Let's dial that back and see how it can kind of like support what we're playing with some dry tone. Let's jump down to mode B, which I think is my favorite of the tunnel options, where you have kind of like some very sub-octavey samples being brought back to create some really kind of menacing sounds. So I dig that for that kind of like triggered envelope opening sound. Really kills your attack in a way that I really like. So let's get the Volante back on and kind of treat this like it's a synthesizer at the start of a signal chain. jumping down to Strum, this is a really interesting set of engines because it essentially takes the last thing you played or the last couple of things you played and throws it back at you. It's almost like shaking up your last couple of notes in a jar and then dumping it out in front of you, is the best way I can describe it. And so I think it has to be heard to be understood. So we've dialed in our dry mix so that we've got plenty of our real guitar, and we'll just kind of like play a couple of notes and then see what happens when we stop playing. So you can hear that. It kind of stays out of the way while you're playing. And then once you're done, it takes that last little bit. Activity knob's going to control how dense the pattern that you're hearing back is. You can hear as you turn it up, it starts to kind of like jumble things a little bit more aggressively. I think C tends to be my favorite mode in this one because that's where you start getting a lot of those notes kind of cascading back at you. Let's go up to double speed for this one just for fun. Let's set it to reverse. What I really like about this mode, especially with reverse, is that kind of stereo width that you're hearing. It allows those reverse notes to come back at you, but it feels like they're flying past you, not directly back down the signal that you sent them up in. And of course, mode D, as with always, you've got something that's got some double speed in there. Take those down to half speed. You need some real bird sounds if you do some palm muting. Okay, and that brings us to our last set of engines here, and also the smallest set of parameters. We have the multi-delay box with pattern delays and warped delays there within. These are pretty straightforward and incredibly, incredibly fun. We're going to start things off very, very straightforward. We're going to start with our first pattern multi-delay. All four of these are essentially it's just four different patterns, and the number of delay lines introduced in is controlled by that activity knob. So let's start off with pattern A and see how quickly things get big. So very straightforward. Bring up that activity knob. Let's kill our reverb right now so you can really hear exactly what's happening with those delay lines. More delay lines. And what's really great about this mode is we can go back to that single linear delay line, take it down to like a half, hit that reverse, and dial back that filter a little bit, and all of a sudden, and then reintroduce more of that activity. I love a good reverse delay. Okay, let's get things back to normal. Let's open that filter up. Keep that activity right at noon. Pattern 2. Pattern 3. Pattern 4. Such a good stereo delay, like a nice, crazy, it's awesome. And once more in reverse. pattern delay. It's very cool. It's probably the most straightforward thing in the entire pedal, but it's so robust. It's really great. Okay, and that brings us to the final mode in this pedal, the warp engines. It is another series of multi-delays where the more you turn up that activity, the more delay lines are introduced. But it's basically 4 different effects applied to that multi-delay. You have a envelope-controlled filter, you have a bandpass filter, you have pitch shifting, and the 4th one is these really weird kind of cross-faded delay lines. It's very strange. It gets granular. You'll hear it when we get there. We're going to run through all of these with the activity up at noon so you can kind of hear what's happening. So you hear that filter. Okay, this is sound way too good with reverb. So we're bringing the reverb back in. Okay, I have no idea how long this video has become. We have shot this over the course of 3 different days. I have already filled up a memory card once. We have a lot of footage to dig through for this video. But if you made it this far, thank you for joining us. We are going to go out with some demonstrations of the built-in phrase looper. So what we are going to do is loop the way that I like to loop in the microcosm, which is by essentially creating a tape loop that is just blank. As our first pass, I'll kind of like watch my tap tempo go on the pedal to set my in point and my out point for a few bars of silence that I can then start filling in as we kind of work our way through different modes and everything. So we are going to stay with the looper in post effects. So everything we do with engines and everything will all be applied to the looper in finality, I guess is the best way to put that. You can have the looper be ahead of the engines so that the things saved in the looper can then be manipulated and torn apart and recontextualized by the different engines, which is really cool. But we are going to basically just use it as a tape loop that we are going to be printing effects onto. I wonder if you can hear that train going by outside. Hopefully you can. I was going to say can't, but can, because otherwise this is a weird rambly moment that you guys are not privy to. So we are going to start our tape loop. We are going to play with the speed and the direction, which, by the way, is one of my favorite things about this pedal, the ability to kind of quantize, drop the pitch of this loop and increase the pitch, and use that to kind of add interesting dynamics and kind of sub-octave stuff and chirpy flyaway, very Yonsei-esque moments in our loop. So let's get started.